We're going to move on now and start talking about roots. And generally there are two types of root systems. The taproot system, which is on this side, and you'll remember this is the dicot or 2-cotyledon seed that's associated with the taproot, and then the fibrous system on this side. You can see the fibrous system is much more complex and there's no single dominant root, whereas in the taproot system there is generally a single dominant root. And frequently the rule of thumb is that however tall the plant is, the taproot generally goes that deep into the ground. So if it's a 10-foot tall plant, the taproot will go down into the ground approximately 10 feet. This is a longitudinal cross section of a root tip, with the root tip being down here, and you can divide the root into several zones. There are 4 zones shown here. The first is the zone of cell differentiation, which is where the undifferentiated cells differentiate into cells that are committed to being root cells. The zone of elongation, which is the area where the root becomes longer. The zone of cell division, which is where cells divide and again cause the expansion of the root. And then the root cap, which you can tell that a lot of the area of the root cap is not living. There's a lot of empty cell bodies here without a nuclei, etc. And this is what pushes through the dirt, allows the root to extend down into the ground. If we do a lateral cross section, we can see that the root is divided into several parts. You have the outside part here, which is called the epidermis. Then the next part, which is just inside the epidermis, which is called the exodermis, sometimes also known as the sclerenchyma. Then inside of that is the root cortex, which is the parenchymal cells of the root. And then the area around the vascular bundle in the root is called the pericycle. And inside the center is the vascular bundle with both xylem and phloem for the transportation of materials in the root. Here's another example of the same thing, and what you see here is the meristemetic tissue. You remember that the meristemetic tissue produces the new areas of, and in this case it would be new areas of root. Again, the xylem and phloem. In this case, the phloem is separate and on the outside here, whereas the xylem is in the central area of this root. So the cortex of the root, which we pointed out in the last slide, are the cells that store things such as glucose and starch. Like a carrot is actually just a big taproot, and it has a lot of cortex, which is what we end up eating. The vascular cambrium is this area here that contains the vascular tissue as well as the meristemetic tissue that forms the new vascular tissue. And then the pericycle, which is on the outside here, around the outside of this area, and it has the undifferentiated cells that allow for branching of the root and forming of new roots. Now the third part of the vegetative cycle portions of the root of the plant are the stems. And again, we're looking at a dicot stem on this side and a monocot stem on this side. Remember, I said the dicot stem has its vascular tissue all arranged in a nice ring like this. The monocot has vascular tissue sort of scattered throughout, the vascular bundle scattered throughout, and in between is the ground tissue. The center part of the stem is called the pith, P-I-T-H. The outer part here is the cortex. Now, the purpose of the stem is severalfold. One is to support and manufacture the plant's leaves, so it supports the leaf structure, which is where all the photosynthesis occurs. The second is to conduct water and nutrients up and down the plant, so it has this vascular tissue for that purpose. And then third is that some photosynthesis actually occurs in the stem as well. So you have these three purposes for these stems in the plant. Now this is looking at what is called a woody stem. In a woody stem you have what's known as the inner bark, which is in this area right here. This actually has a lot of the xylem and phloem. You have phloem on the outside here, xylem on the inside. This is the woody bark here, or the inner bark here. And then in between the inner and outer bark is the cork cambium, right in this area right here, which produces the cork, or the outer bark here. And the outer bark is dead cork cells here that resist the penetration from the outside of water and gases, and then some parasites as well cannot get through that, and it protects the stem. Now, woody stems have the advantage of forming what's known as growth rings, and this is related to the amount of water that's present at various times of the year. And during rapid growth in the spring and summer, the aspect of the stem is light in color. During the darker times of winter and fall, it's dark, and these form very easily recognized rings that show the age of the plant. Now, when we talk about plants, they can be classified in two ways. One way is to classify them as either non-vascular, meaning they do not have xylem and phloem and vascular bundles, or vascular. The non-vascular plants are simpler, they grow close to the ground, and they don't have formal leaves, roots, and stems. They're generally a group called the mosses. Vascular plants have a vascular system that carries water and other nutrients. They grow much larger and taller. They have leaves, roots, and stems, and some of them have flowers or cones. Now, both these types of plants obviously need water, and both of these are equally alive. Now, the simple non-vascular plants, such as bryophytes, which is a fancy word for moss, go through something called alternation of generation. The alternation of generation is a life cycle where you have both a multicellular diploid form and a multicellular haploid form. Remember, diploid is 2 N chromosomes and haploid is 1 N chromosome. So here is the start of the haploid generation over here. You have the male and female gametocytes. These come together and first of all, this is a female spore, and it produces a female plant. This is a male spore that produces a male plant. Then these are both haploid plants, and they produce both sperm and eggs. The eggs come in an area called the archegonium. The sperm are in the antheridium. The pollination then occurs, and you have an egg. This embryo is now diploid and forms the sporophyte form, which is the 2N. It produces spores, and these spores then produce the gametophyte forms again. And that's what's known as the alternation of generations. Now, as I said, the male aspect of the plant is called the antheridia. The antheridia are shown, I'm just looking here for a second, up in this area right here. They produce the sperm. The archegonium are here. So you have an archegonium here, or archegonia, and antheridia. The sperm enters the top of the archegonia and fertilizes the egg here. It goes through a series of steps, and a 2N diploid embryo is formed, which then becomes a young sporophyte and then a mature sporophyte, and the spores then produce male and female plants. The dominant generation is the generation between the gametocyte generation and the sporophyte generation. Whichever one occupies the largest portion of the life cycle is called the dominant generation. Now this is an example of a fern. A fern is a vascular plant but does not produce seeds, and it also goes through alternation of generation. And you can see here is a sporophyte form here. It produces spores in a little area right here called the sporangium. These spores then are released. The spores have haploid number of chromosomes. They produce a young gametophyte, which is shown right here. The young gametophyte has an archegonium and an antheridium, an egg and sperm. Fertilization occurs, and then a zygote, which is a diploid structure, is then formed, and you have a new sporophyte. You can tell by looking at it, this is what we generally associate with a fern, is the mature sporophyte generation. The new leaves are called fiddleheads because that's exactly what they look like. They look like little fiddleheads. Sometimes, now the dominant generation in this fern is the sporophyte generation. Sometimes you have to really look carefully to find the gametophyte generation. More complex plants, vascular plants, are the conifers. Conifers are cone bearers. They're also called gymnosperms. Gymnosperm means naked seed, which means they do not form a specific fruit like the angiosperms do. And they form two types of cones, male cones and female cones. The male cones produce pollen, which is the sperm. The female cones produce the eggs. When germination occurs or fertilization occurs, then a new plant is then produced. So the seed cone or female cone produces the seeds. The pollen cone or the male cone, this is the male cone, this is the female cone. This actually can occur in the same tree, and it's common for there to be self-pollination. And the pollen is that fine dust that occurs associated with the male cone. Then the most complex is the angiosperms, and the angiosperms are distinguished by the formation of true flowers, which have both male and female parts. The pistil is where the female part is, and then these little branches here are anthers, where the male part is. Fertilization occurs, and then seeds are produced. And a fruit is just a adaptation of the ovary around the seed that aids in its dispersal. So the fruit is a structure that develops around the fertilized seed. If the seed is not fertilized, then the fruit does not form. And as I said, the cotyledon we talked about before is the seed leaf. So that is the overview of the Kingdom Plantae. Next week we will have another lecture on the plant kingdom.